Story about the BBC and the Chancellor, I'm sure very well sourced. The overall implication of that is about £500 million out of the BBC's budget for programmes. And you've got a story, I think, from the Sunday Express.
Yes, the Sunday Express has done it, and we've done this story as well. 800 million out of the BBC budget. I imagine there are quite a few people in this building at the moment feeling quite nervous.
Breaking
and,
sweat.
yeah, wondering how to respond to this rather clever raid on the BBC's finances. Because what he's saying is, look, you can start charging people for iPlayers. You know, at the moment, too many people are watching the BBC for nothing. They're not paying their licence fee. They're watching, you know, at home on digital, and it's losing the BBC money. He says you can charge a bit for that. You won't get that much from that, I have to warn you now. But at the same time, you're going to lose a massive chunk because the state is going to stop issuing free licences to the over 75s. And they're saying, BBC, you've got to do it yourself. And that's quite a smart way of trying to cut back on the BBC budget.
I guess the big question, I'm sure you won't want to talk about this, that kind of money means the closure of big channels, big radio stations. You know, viewers and listeners will really notice it. Are the Conservatives keen for that kind of fight?
Viewers may well notice it, but viewers are also watching other things besides the BBC.
Sure.
And I imagine that what they're saying at the moment, and it might not be a welcome message here, is that times have changed and that not everybody is watching the national broadcaster or wants the national broadcaster to do everything.
Sure.
Because the BBC, like a lot of public sector things, has sort of expanded and expanded and is all over everywhere. And it's saying, well, what is the BBC's core mission? And
well, maybe we'll hear the Chancellor on that later on. It'll be very interesting.
One note as a political hack rather than a BBC man, it's clever for another reason. The first document on David Cameron's desk when he became Prime Minister was easy money is taking it away from the wealthy pensioners, but he's always refused to do it. What he's now doing is saying, you, the BBC, now fund these free licences for some wealthy pensioners, obviously not all of them are, and if you want to cut it, be our guest, then you can spend the money. So in other words, he is delegating a decision he didn't dare take himself to the BBC.
That is very, very clever.
That's well observed.
Let's move on. A little bit of local housekeeping. There's some various cheerfully menacing stories about the BBC all over and the budget all over the newspapers today. Standing back a little bit, what kind of BBC would you like to see?
Well, look, the BBC is a really important national institution and a fantastic broadcaster that produces some of the best television and radio in the world. And we want to give it a sustainable future in an age when the technology is changing, when there are lots of other broadcasters out there. But the BBC is also a publicly funded public institution. And so it does need to make savings and contribute to what we need to do as a country to get our house in order. So we are in discussion with the BBC. Of course, we've got the charter renewal process going on as well. And when we have conclusions we can talk about, we'll come and talk about them.
Now, one of the things, I know you can't talk about the budget, but one of the things that is suggested is the BBC would take over the cost of licences for older people, and in return there'd be some kind of deal. The net effect of that, according to all the papers and all the commentators, would be about £500 million out of the BBC's operating money, which would be the equivalent of closing, for instance, Radio 2, Radio 5 Live, or possibly a big TV channel. Is that the kind of thing you'd be comfortable to happen on your watch?
Well, I remember 5 years ago doing a deal with the BBC, the then Director General Mark Thompson, where actually the BBC did make around £500 million of savings, or took on £500 million worth of responsibilities, including things like the BBC World Service. I was told at the time by people they're going to shut down BBC Two, they're going to close Radio 4. Funny enough, they always seem to pick the the juiciest fruit on the tree. I would say the BBC is a well-run organisation under Tony Hall. I'm absolutely sure that they can make a contribution. But I want the BBC to have a strong future. And you would know this better than most, Andrew, there are massive technological changes that if we don't address will mean the licence fee income will slowly disappear. And I think, therefore, that's the basis of a deal we can do.
But there is a sort of philosophical question about what kind of organisation the BBC should be. Should it be pure market failure, things that nobody else would do, or should it be making big popular programmes like, for instance, Strictly? Which side of that argument do you come down?
Well, I would absolutely want the BBC to go on making fantastic programmes like Strictly. I'm straying into your world here, but I would say you want the BBC to be producing popular programmes that people want to watch. I think if the BBC decides it's only going to do niche things, then it loses its argument. But I think you are able to say to the BBC things like, and this is more for the charter renewal, if you look at your website, you know, what's the Times newspaper or the Telegraph newspaper or the Daily Mail or the Sun or the Mirror going to look like in 10 years' time? It's going to be an online paper, probably. And so, therefore, if you've got a website that's got features and cooking recipes and all sorts of, you effectively, the BBC website becomes the national newspaper as well as the national broadcaster. And there are those sorts of issues which I think we need to look very carefully. I don't think you used to edit a national newspaper.
Not very well.
Talking yourself down, but you wouldn't want the BBC to completely crowd out national newspapers.
No.
And if you look at the BBC website, it's a good product, but it is becoming a bit more imperial in its ambitions.
Very interesting indeed. Imperial or otherwise, good luck on budget.